All right, my friend. Hi, guys. Welcome to another long, meandering journey through time. You've stumbled into a place where the voices of the past become a soft murmur, where the sands of Mesopotamia shift beneath your imagination, and where tonight, instead of the hurried bustle of the modern world, we let ourselves sink slowly into the rhythms of ancient Babylon. You may already feel your shoulders loosen, your eyes grow heavy, as if they too were leaning against those vast brick walls beneath the shadow of the ziggurats. Tonight, we will be speaking of food, of indulgence, of the strange little snacks that Babylonians once reached for the way we might reach for chips, or sweets, or a late-night cookie. What was junk food before neon lights, plastic wrappers, and greasy paper bags? You never imagined it, but Babylon had its own guilty pleasures, its own shortcuts, its own foods that carried with them both comfort and consequence. But before we descend into the flavors of that world, let's pause here, together, at the threshold. Hello, my friend. Hi, guys. Greetings. Traveler of history, I want to ask you something quietly, as if in a whisper across a dimly lit room. When was the last time you ate not because of hunger, but because of longing? Not because your body demanded sustenance, but because your heart demanded solace? Perhaps a piece of chocolate late at night. Perhaps a handful of salty nuts before sleep. Perhaps something that you regretted afterward. Yet you found yourself doing it anyway. Imagine, now, that this same tug of temptation stretched back thousands of years. That even in Babylon, where kings inscribed their laws upon stone and priests chanted before the gods, ordinary people still found themselves drawn to the same impulses, snacking, indulging, reaching for what we might call their junk food. You and I know Babylon through its grandeur, the hanging gardens whispered about by ancient travelers, the massive walls, the rivers that split the city like veins of silver. But beneath that majesty lay the quiet, very human truth of life. The cravings, the weariness, the small escapes. Junk food, after all, is not really about nourishment. It is about comfort, distraction, rebellion against the rigid order of the day. And if we walk slowly down the alleys of Babylon, past the market stalls with their clay jars of dates, their mounds of roasted chickpeas, their skewers of questionable meats, we will see it, we will smell it. The smoky oil, the sticky syrup, the sour tang of fermented things sold cheaply and eaten quickly. The heartbeat of an empire was built on these small indulgences, no less than on law or war. Let us begin gently, with your imagination as our guide. Imagine yourself, my friend, stepping through the Ishtar Gate at dusk. The bricks glow with cobalt glaze, lions stride eternally across the walls, and you are just one more figure slipping into the pulse of the city. The air is thick with spice and dust, the voices of vendors rising and falling like waves. Someone is selling honey cakes, still warm from a clay oven, their sweetness already clinging to your fingertips before you taste them. Another sells roasted onions, charred and dripping with oil, eaten quickly by laborers with calloused hands. A child runs past holding a sticky ball of dates mashed with nuts, a primitive version of candy. And the question lingers, how different is that from the things we sneak into our own mouths when no one is watching? Tonight, we will wander through that city slowly, as one wanders through a dream. We will not rush, we will not force the pace. Instead, I will take your hand gently, through stories of markets and taverns, through kitchens and temples, through feasts and famines. Because junk food in Babylon was not only food, it was ritual, temptation, survival, and sometimes even danger. You will see how these indulgences reflected the very structure of their world, their class divisions, their trade networks, their spiritual fears. A snack was never just a snack. It was an echo of empire. And I wonder, as you settle deeper into your seat or your pillow, whether you feel the resonance of that truth, that something as small as a piece of fried dough could reveal the anxieties of a civilization, that the crumbs left on a potter's floor could tell us about the rise and fall of kings. History, after all, is never about the grand declarations carved in stone alone. It is about the small, the intimate, the everyday, about the woman who bought fried onions because she was too tired to cook, about the child who craved a sweet date cake on his way home from the temple, about the soldier who washed down sour beer with handfuls of salted seeds, trying to forget the dust of war. So, my dear friend, let us take this slow breath together and step inside. The gates are open, the night air is warm, and the city of Babylon stretches before us. In the glow of torches and the hum of voices, the story of junk food awaits. And as you listen, perhaps you will feel the rhythm of their lives steady, weary, indulgent, no different from ours, and perhaps that rhythm will lull you gently toward rest. Under the dim bronze haze of a Babylonian dusk, when the sun slid down like a molten coin over the zigzagged rooftops and the hum of the Euphrates carried whispers into every corner of the city, the real story of indulgence began, not in the palaces, not in the temples with their incense and chanting, but in the dust of the markets where ordinary people pressed shoulder to shoulder, stomachs tugged by craving more than by need. Imagine yourself there, my friend, as the stone beneath your feet still radiates the heat of the day, and the air holds a thickness that is half smoke, half spice, half sweat. Yes, a city always has more than one half, it seems, because it is made of layers, contradictions, overlapping hungers. You walk past tall amphorae sealed with clay, the faint tang of sour beer seeping through their lids, the kind of beer that was less about pleasure and more about dulling the senses after labor in the fields. Yet still, in its cheap harshness, it became a kind of junk food in liquid form, gulped quickly by men whose hands bore the grooves of endless toil. And just beside, a vendor holds out a platter of fried dough, oil glistening under torchlight, a sheen that would have drawn the eye as irresistibly then as a neon sign does now. The dough is heavy, salty at the edges where it touched the pan, and laced with sesame seeds that crackle between teeth. It is not the bread of ceremony, not the carefully baked loaves offered to gods, but something humbler, greasier, more immediate, food that fills quickly and vanishes just as fast, leaving only the craving for more. The rhythm of Babylon, in its grandeur, is often told through its walls and its laws, yet the rhythm of its nights lived instead through these small exchanges, where coins of copper or bits of grain changed hands for a snack, where hunger was not just about survival, but about distraction. Think of the laborer who had no family waiting at home, whose room was little more than a shadowed corner, and so he lingered at the stall, taking another skewer of roasted chickpeas, salted until the lips burned, a primitive echo of the bags of nuts or crisps that tempt us today. He ate not because his body lacked strength, but because the silence of going home empty was too loud, and the salt on his tongue was easier to bear than the emptiness of solitude. Junk food has always been about filling voids that hunger alone does not define, and as the night deepened, the smells thickened burnt onions, crushed garlic, the syrupy smoke of dates being boiled down into molasses, thick enough to coat fingers, sticky enough to cling to memory. You can almost see a child darting toward that sweetness, a ball of mashed dates rolled in flour to keep them from sticking, clutched tight like treasure. His mother scolds, but not too harshly, because she too remembers what it was like to steal a bite of something forbidden, something unnecessary, yet irresistible. This is where you realize that Babylonian junk food was not only about taste, but about the small rebellions that make life tolerable. Dates were sacred, yes, but they were also cheap enough to mash into candies, their sugar surging briefly in the blood, offering the illusion of energy for another hour. And doesn't that mirror the candy bars, the fizzy drinks, the midnight ice cream of our own restless lives? You see, time does not erase the rhythm of craving, it only changes the wrappers. Step further into the alleys, where taverns pulse with rough laughter, where the clay mugs clink together, where someone dunks flatbread into broth spiced just enough to sting. Here the food is not refined, it is not the feast of kings. It is over. Salted fish, fried until bones splinter between the teeth, swallowed fast with gulps of beer to wash down the bitterness. It is meat skewered and left too long over flame, charred black at the edges, eaten more for the act of chewing than for nourishment. The tavern owner knows this well, just as the street vendor does. The people come for relief, for comfort, for escape, and the food serves that purpose as faithfully as any priest serves his God. The rhythm of their lives demanded something quick, something strong, something that numbed the tongue and silenced the thoughts. And yet, not all indulgence was so coarse. In the richer quarters, where lamps burned longer and houses held more than one room, Another kind of Babylonian junk food appeared, honey cakes spiced with cardamom, sesame brittle snapped between polished teeth, and wine thickened with herbs. These were not the staples of survival, but the whispers of luxury trickling downward, the sweet excesses that even servants sometimes tasted when scraps fell their way. Picture a platter carried out after a gathering, half picked at. The crumbs left behind, not wasted but pocketed quickly by a watchful hand, carried home to be savored in secret. For what is junk food if not also the taste of what we are told we should not have? That forbidden sweetness carries its own intoxication. And always, the city smelled of frying oil. It clung to hair, to clothing, to the very walls of the market. Even priests returning from ritual carried that scent, though they would never admit to indulgence. You can imagine them pausing on their walk, looking long at a stall, perhaps sending a boy to fetch something so that their own hands would remain unstained. For even those closest to the gods were not immune to the pull of human appetite. Babylon, after all, was not a place of perfection. It was a place of striving, of longing, of endless attempts to grasp at something beyond reach. And junk food, in its greasy simplicity, was one of the ways that longing revealed itself. The deeper you sink into this vision, the more you see the city not as an empire but as a collection of mouths, each one searching. Each snack tells you a story. Roasted lentils bought by a girl too tired to cook. Flatbread spread with pungent cheese eaten by men huddled in the shadows. Onions charred until they filled the night air with sweetness and smoke. These were the comforts of Babylon, as fleeting and forgettable as the lives that consumed them, yet no less essential for that. For history, my friend, is not only written in stone, it is written in crumbs, in grease stains, in the faint smell of dates lingering on fingers. And as you drift further into this story, perhaps you feel your own eyelids heavy, lulled by the rhythm of their lives, the eternal cycle of hunger and relief, indulgence and regret. And so, my friend, as we move deeper into the heartbeat of Babylon, you notice how the simple stalls of the marketplace gave way to something grander, something woven not only from hunger but from pride, power, and ritual. And here, in the long halls of feasting, junk food transformed into an unspoken language of hierarchy. Imagine the great banquet tables stretching beneath painted ceilings, guarded by the shadows of colossal statues, and at first you might expect to see only the refinement of roasted lamb or carefully baked bread, offerings fit for kings and priests. But if you lean closer, if you let your imagination walk among the platters, you will find a more mischievous truth, that even in these hallowed halls, where law and myth mingled with wine, there were indulgences as cheap and excessive as the fried dough of the markets, the guilty pleasures that made the banquets roar louder and spill deeper into the night. Picture it, sticky confections of dates and honey pressed into shapes so rich that guests could hardly finish them. Yet they reached again and again, their fingers shining with syrup under the lamplight, because such food was never about need, but about the thrill of excess, a sugar rush before the concept had a name. The cloying sweetness clung to tongues and dulled conversation, but it kept the night alive, just as a bowl of candies might keep us restless in our own dim-lit living rooms today. And then there were the endless pitchers of beer, thick, cloudy, almost gritty with the remnants of barley that had not fully dissolved. Flavored at times with herbs to mask its roughness, a drink that blurred the edges of the mind, consumed in quantities that transformed celebration into chaos. You might think of beer as common as the daily drink of the masses. And indeed it was. But at the feasts, it became something else, consumed, not for thirst but for abandon, gulped alongside mouthfuls of salted fish, fried crisp until the bones cracked loudly, the sound swallowed by the laughter of men who leaned too heavily into their cups. It is here you realize that junk food was not confined to the poor, nor to the quiet alleys, but that indulgence traveled upward, always finding its way into the hands of those who sought to escape themselves for a moment, no matter how gilded the walls around them. Look at the servants carrying trays heavy with roasted vegetables glossed in oil, with chunks of meat skewered and spiced until their natural flavor was smothered under salt and smoke. These were not the carefully seasoned dishes prepared with restraint, but rather the kinds of foods meant to overwhelm the senses, to flood the body with an immediate rush, a satiation that lasted minutes before fading into the same emptiness it was meant to cure. Even kings and generals, drunk with conquest and power, leaned back and reached for one more honey cake, one more skewer dripping with fat, one more piece of bread dipped into sharp, pungent cheese that burned the mouth and made the heart yearn for water. Junk food, in these halls, became a spectacle of abundance, a way to prove that Babylon could not only feed but overfeed, that it could drown its people in the very things that made them weak. And yet, as the torches burned low and the musicians' fingers grew weary, the feast often revealed its darker underbelly. For in the shadows of these gatherings, there were those who consumed not out of joy but out of despair, who sought to bury grief in mouthfuls of greasy food, who chewed because silence felt unbearable. Perhaps it was a widow of war, dressed in plain cloth but permitted to sit at the far end of the feast, her hands trembling as she reached for fried onions, for bread dripping with oil, her hunger not of the body but of the spirit. Perhaps it was a young soldier, recently returned, laughing too loudly, eating too much, trying to silence the images still burning behind his eyes. Junk food, in such moments, was more than indulgence. It was refuge, flimsy though it was, fragile as sugar in the rain. And what of the entertainers, the dancers whose bodies glimmered with sweat and oil beneath the torchlight? They too were sustained by quick bites between performances, by candied figs pressed hastily into their hands, by roasted seeds tucked into their cheeks as they prepared for another dance. Their lives were marked by the same pattern as ours: the work, the exhaustion, the need for something that could be swallowed quickly, that could give a fleeting spark of energy. Junk food was the secret thread binding laborer and noble, priest and servant, soldier and dancer, each one drawn to its promise of quick satisfaction, each one finding in it a small rebellion against the endless demands of Babylonian life. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the echo of those feasts, the sticky fingers, the heavy air, the torches dripping wax onto clay floors, the laughter breaking into quarrels, the shadows of men staggering outside, their lips still slick with honey and beer. Imagine the scraps left behind, the half-chewed morsels swept away by servants, carried into alleys where children snatched them and devoured them greedily, tasting the luxury of the wealthy in the form of discarded sweets. Even waste became indulgence in this city, a cycle where nothing truly disappeared, only shifted from one hand to another. And perhaps you notice the same rhythm in your own world, where the leftovers of feasts become the secret cravings of another day, where the craving itself never dies but only changes form. The feasts of Babylon were, in their grandeur, a mirror of the markets you walked through before. But here the scale was greater, the consequences sharper. For indulgence at this level was not simply about comfort, it was about power, about the ability to consume beyond reason, about showing that the empire could afford waste, could afford excess, could afford to gorge itself while others scraped by. And in that truth lies a quiet warning, one that hums beneath the story like a low note. That civilizations, like people, are often undone not by hunger, but by indulgence, by the endless chase for more sweetness, more salt, more distraction, until the very foundations tremble beneath the weight. And yet, even in that warning, there is tenderness. Because when you imagine the individuals within it, the child clutching a stolen sweet, the soldier gnawing at charred meat, the widow finding comfort in fried onions, you see not greed, but longing. Longing to ease pain, longing to feel alive, longing to hold on to something fleeting. Junk food, in Babylon, was both a symptom and a cure, a contradiction baked into its very nature. And perhaps as you sit here listening, your own body at rest, you feel the pull of that same contradiction, the recognition that craving is as much a part of being human as breathing, and that in these cravings, we meet those who lived thousands of years before us. And so the feast fades, the torches sputter, and the city sighs into darkness. Outside the palace, the streets are quiet again, though the scent of oil and honey still clings to the air. You walk with me once more, through the silence, back toward the markets, knowing now that indulgence was not an exception but a constant, weaving through every layer of Babylonian life. And as we step into the next wandering, we will follow those cravings into the taverns and alleyways where shadow and temptation were even sharper, where junk food was not only about indulgence but about survival, When the last echo of feasting slipped away into silence and the palace torches dwindled to glowing embers, Babylon did not truly rest, because the city's heartbeat lingered in smaller chambers, in crooked alleyways, in taverns hidden between walls of baked brick, where the voices of the weary carried low into the night. And here, if you let yourself drift with me deeper into those streets, you will see that the story of indulgence takes on a rawer edge, stripped of grandeur, stripped of ritual, down to its most human form. The taverns of Babylon were not built for beauty. They were built for relief. Clay walls stained by smoke, benches worn smooth by countless elbows, and above all, the smell, heavy and unrelenting, of fried things sizzling in oil that had been used far too many times, yet still served its purpose. Imagine stepping into that air, thick enough to cling to your hair, the scent of chickpeas fried until they hardened into golden pebbles, of onions charred until they nearly blackened, of bread reheated again and again until its surface crackled but its core was dense and stale. None of it was noble, none of it was refined, but all of it was consumed with the kind of hunger that comes not from the stomach, but from the spirit, the hunger of men and women who sought to bury fatigue, loneliness, or dread in something quick, something salty, something hot against the tongue. You might picture soldiers here, their sandals caked with dust, faces shadowed not only by helmets but by memories they would not share, sitting shoulder to shoulder, mugs of cloudy beer clutched in one hand, the other scooping up roasted lentils so heavily salted that their lips cracked as they ate. They laughed too loudly, argued too sharply, shoved one another playfully until the play turned briefly into anger, and then laughed again, because the food and drink were their way of pressing against the edge of silence, their way of saying, "I am still here, still alive." And perhaps across the same bench sat a merchant, worn from haggling all day, his fingers stained with ink from his accounts. And though he could have gone home, he stayed to chew dried fish, so pungent it masked the taste of exhaustion, because to sit alone in the quiet would have been worse. In that moment, junk food became not only indulgence but also a bridge, a way to keep company, a way to let time blur until sleep came easier. And in the corners of those taverns you would have seen women too, women whose lives were bound to work harsher than daylight ever revealed, slipping bites of fried bread into their mouths between serving mugs, biting so quickly they burned their tongues but hardly noticed. They ate in snatches, the way you or I might snatch a cookie in secret, not for the joy of it but for the energy to last another hour. Sometimes they licked the honey from their own fingers when a platter of sweetmeats was carried past, not theirs to claim, yet impossible to resist touching. The sweetness lingered, and for a fleeting moment they were not servants but children again, holding stolen treats in alleyways. The tavern magnified this truth. Junk food was not simply for leisure. It was survival. It was solace. It was memory, all tangled together. Listen to the soundscape of that room. My friend, the crackle of oil, the hiss of skewers meeting flame, the thud of mugs on clay tables, the murmur of half-drunken songs. The rhythm was as old as craving itself. Bite, swallow, laugh, sigh, reach again. No feast of kings could drown sorrow quite like these simple things did. The oil that popped on the pan was like a hymn of defiance, a reminder that even in the shadow of palaces, even in the iron grip of laws carved into stone, the common people carved out their own forms of comfort, one fried onion at a time. And if you imagine yourself there, seated at that bench, chewing the same greasy bread, drinking the same harsh beer, you may realize that the centuries between then and now are thin, that the rhythm of their nights is the rhythm of ours. Quick bites between obligations, salt, and sugar, as bandages for wounds deeper than the body. And yet, these indulgences carried shadows too, because oil that was reused too many times carried sickness, because salted fish dried in the sun turned sour if kept too long, because beer left uncovered grew foul. Many nights, men staggered home with more than dizziness. They carried fevers, stomachs twisting, bodies weakened not by hunger, but by the very food meant to fill them. Babylonian junk food, like our own, carried its punishment in silence, consequences deferred until too late. Still, people returned, because the alternative was worse, because life without small indulgences felt unbearable. It was the same paradox you and I know. The knowledge that what we crave is not what is best for us, but to live without it feels like no life at all. And so, the taverns thrived, their shadows thick with laughter and regret, with indulgence and consequence. And in them you glimpse the true humanity of Babylon, the lives not written in clay tablets, not sung in hymns, but lived in mouthfuls of fried dough, in gulps of sour beer, in the sticky sweetness of date molasses dripped onto a worn table. These were the fragments of survival, the small rebellions, the sighs of people who carried the weight of empire on their backs and needed something, anything, to soften the load for one night. And as the night wears on, and you, my friend, lean back into the rhythm of their voices, you feel the story drifting deeper, like the current of the Euphrates carrying you past the lights of the taverns, toward the quieter alleys where indulgence took on yet another form. For Babylon's cravings did not end here. They spilled into the streets, into homes, into whispered exchanges by firelight. And that is where we will wander next, into the private corners where junk food became not only public indulgence, but secret ritual. As the years gathered like shadows at the edge of her reign, Elizabeth carried herself with the same brilliance, the same carefully constructed radiance that had dazzled ambassadors in her youth. The portraits painted her eternal, white face gleaming with powder, crimson lips curved with command, eyes sharp with intelligence that refused to dim. And yet behind that painted armor, the human body whispered its truths. Time marked her in ways that no pigment could disguise, and one of those whispers was written in her smile, or rather, in what had slowly been taken from it. The sugar that had comforted her, the candied violets, the marchpane roses, the gilded gingerbread, had left their trace not only in memory but in flesh. Her teeth, once strong, had darkened, loosened, receded, until her mouth bore the quiet ruin of indulgence. And still, she could not, would not abandon the sweetness. There is something deeply human in that paradox, is there not? To know that what you crave has already wounded you, and yet to reach for it again. Elizabeth, sovereign of a kingdom that stretched across seas, could command armies, could dictate policy, could bend courtiers to her will, but she could not quiet the call of sugar. In that small defiance, she was no different from us, caught between reason and longing, between discipline and comfort. And perhaps that is why her later years shimmer with a strange intimacy. The Virgin Queen, painted untouchable, was yet undone by something as ordinary, as universal, as a sweet tooth. Imagine her now in her later chamber, older, more fragile, yet still unwilling to yield the performance of majesty. The candles burn low, her ladies fuss with her gowns, her counselors await outside with the burdens of the state. On a nearby table, a dish of candied fruits glistens, the sugared surface catching the light. She lifts one to her lips, her hand trembling only slightly, and tastes the same sweetness she has known since childhood. It does not matter that her teeth ache, that decay has crept into her mouth. For that moment, she is soothed, transported, sustained by the same indulgence that has always walked beside her. Junk food, if we dare to call it so, becomes, in this chamber, not trivial but essential, a thread binding her to her past, a comfort against the relentless march of age. The court still performed its feasts, still staged its spectacles. But by now, Elizabeth was more than the central figure, she was the myth around which they revolved. And yet, even myths have cravings. While ambassadors marveled at subtleties shaped like ships or fortresses, while courtiers whispered about favors and rivalries, Elizabeth's private indulgences remained the same. The comfits, the wafers, the candied fruits followed her through the decades, loyal companions in a life where loyalty was rare. And the more her body bore the evidence of indulgence, the more her image leaned into artifice. The face powdered white to mask age, the lips painted to suggest youth, the smile controlled so as not to betray what lay behind. Food had always been theater, but now the theater expanded to encompass the body itself. Do you sense it, the tension between image and reality, between what is shown and what is hidden? Elizabeth lived in that tension daily, and her indulgences reflected it. Sugar, once a symbol of youth and prosperity, became in her later years both a mask and a revelation. To taste sweetness was to recall triumphs long past, to anchor herself in a world that had changed around her. But it was also to carry the scars of craving, scars that could not be painted away. And so her indulgence became an act of resilience, a quiet insistence on humanity beneath the weight of symbolism. Her people, too, saw the contradictions. They adored her, they mythologized her, they whispered about her blackened teeth, even as they celebrated her victories. On the streets of London, gingerbread queens continued to be sold, their spiced bodies devoured by children who perhaps did not know that the real queen's smile no longer matched the gilded image they consumed. It was junk food turned into propaganda, indulgence turned into loyalty, and Elizabeth herself became both subject and object of that strange transformation. To eat sweetness in her likeness was to honor her, and yet the truth of her own body told a darker tale. Still, she did not relinquish control. Elizabeth was never passive in her myth-making. If sugar marred her teeth, then powder would mask her skin. If indulgence betrayed her humanity, then performance would elevate it into legend. She did not apologize for craving. She simply turned it into part of her story. In that way, junk food, her small, guilty pleasures, became both a weakness and a strength, a private indulgence and a public weapon. For if she could be seen enjoying sweetness, even in age, then she could be seen as enduring, unbroken, still capable of delight, in a world that often demanded only austerity. There is a softness in imagining her this way. Not the hard queen delivering speeches, not the eternal virgin draped in pearls, but the aging woman, weary yet unyielding, finding solace in the same foods that had comforted her for decades. The marchpane, the comfits, the candied fruit, they were not trivial to her. They were anchors, memories, perhaps even companions in solitude. For Elizabeth, who had chosen to remain unmarried, who had bound herself not to one man but to an entire kingdom, solitude was constant. And in solitude, indulgence becomes more than pleasure. It becomes a form of intimacy, a way of soothing the self when no other arms are there. Her junk food was her secret partner, her nightly whisper, her soft rebellion against loneliness. And yet, even here, shadows intruded. Physicians noted her health, courtiers remarked on her fading vitality, ambassadors speculated about her strength. Every indulgence carried consequence, and the marks of sugar on her body were read as signs of decline. But Elizabeth did not let decline define her. She turned indulgence into endurance, sweetness into defiance. Even as her teeth darkened, even as her body aged, she held fast to the rituals that comforted her, and in doing so, she revealed something timeless. That the power of food is not in its nourishment alone, but in its ability to remind us we are alive, that we can still taste, still desire, still crave. So in her later years, the junk food of Elizabeth I, those candied treats, those sugared indulgences, became not just pleasures but symbols of her resilience, her humanity, her refusal to surrender even the smallest comforts to the passage of time. And if her smile no longer gleamed, if whispers circled about the price she paid, then so be it. She remained queen, she remained myth, and her cravings remained her own. To see her this way is to see the paradox of power and humanity entwined. The Virgin Queen, untouchable in history, yet forever touched by the sweetness she could not resist. And so, my friend, as the hush of night deepens and the alleys surrender to silence, you and I walk toward the towering presence of Babylon's temples, where cravings were not simply private indulgence or noisy tavern pleasures, but offerings braided into the fabric of devotion itself. Because in this city of gods and kings, even junk food, even the sticky sweetness of honey or the sharp bite of salted seeds, became something more when placed before an altar. Imagine the great stairways climbing upward, torches flickering along carved stone, priests in robes that smelled faintly of incense and sweat, their hands carrying trays piled high with what might look, to our modern eyes, like street snacks, flatbreads brushed with oil, clusters of dates mashed into cakes, roasted chickpeas spiced and scattered as if they were coins. These were not banquets for the body but for the divine. And yet, when the rituals ended, it was the priests, the attendants, the cleaners of temples, who consumed what the gods had supposedly tasted, and in that moment, the sacred bled into the indulgent. A priest lifting a honey cake from the altar knew he was not meant to hunger, yet he too felt the rush of sweetness on his tongue, knew the comfort of chewing something unnecessary, and perhaps in his heart he whispered that even gods required junk food to be satisfied. Step closer, and you will notice how ritual offerings mirrored human cravings. Bowls of sweet beer left to ferment in the heat, breads fried in oil until the scent itself seemed like prayer, figs and nuts bound together with syrup until they clung like jewels in the lamplight. These were indulgences disguised as worship, and they tell you something unspoken. That the gods of Babylon were never imagined as beings who scorned craving, but rather as beings who demanded to be fed with the same excesses humans fed themselves. The temple was a mirror of the tavern, but with incense, with song, with a weight of awe that disguised what was truly happening, a civilization offering its own junk food to the heavens. And what did it mean? That even in prayer, people clung to sweetness, salt, oil, and beer. Perhaps it meant that desire itself was sacred, that cravings were not flaws but reflections of life's rhythm, that the gods themselves were seen as participants in indulgence. But beneath this sanctity lay something more shadowed, for the offerings were plentiful, and what was not consumed by flame or by priests often made its way back into the hands of the poor who hovered near temple doors, waiting for scraps. A mother might feed her child with bread once meant for Marduk, still warm, still greasy, still carrying the illusion of divinity, though by the time it touched her child's lips it was nothing more than a fried crust. The line between sacred and profane blurred, and junk food became both blessing and burden, a divine indulgence shared downward through the ranks of society. And if you listen closely, you will hear the quiet sigh of those who took what was left, whispering thanks not only to the gods but to the indulgence itself, because hunger had been softened for another night. Yet, indulgence in the temple was not always gentle. There were festivals when the city drowned in excess, when food once offered to the gods was carried out into streets, distributed in chaotic handfuls, devoured by crowds drunk with devotion and beer alike. Imagine a festival night, thousands pressing forward, music roaring, torches burning high, and plates of honey cakes flung into the throng like blessings, snatched by desperate fingers, crumbled in haste, eaten with the frenzy of those who believed the sweetness itself carried the touch of divinity. These were not measured acts of piety but wild indulgences disguised as worship, and in them you glimpse how thin the veil truly was between faith and craving. Junk food in Babylon, at such moments, was not a triviality. It was ecstasy, chaos, communion, a way for mortals to feel close to gods by consuming as gods consumed excessively, thoughtlessly, hungrily, and behind the spectacle, behind the torches and songs, there were always the quiet corners where attendants gathered what was left when the crowd had dispersed, chewing slowly in the fading light, their mouths sticky with the same honey that had just been offered heavenward. It is here, in the aftertaste of ritual, that you realize how indulgence was woven into the cycle of sacred life, inseparable from worship, inseparable from the yearning that drove both prayer and craving. Because what is a prayer, if not a craving given shape? What is an offering, if not an indulgence, wrapped in ritual? The gods of Babylon demanded the same things humans desired: sweetness, salt, oil, intoxication, and in serving them, the people affirmed their own needs as something holy, something worthy of the altar. Yet the shadow of excess was always present. For the same sweets that pleased the gods made men sluggish. The same beers that poured into ritual vessels left priests stumbling. The same fried breads that filled the altars filled bellies too quickly and left sickness in their wake. And still, they returned again and again. Because indulgence has always been stronger than consequence. Because the illusion of comfort outweighs the weight of regret. Because in craving, we find ourselves alive. Babylon did not fear this contradiction. It embraced it, wove it into its very rituals, sanctified it so that no one needed to feel shame. And perhaps that is why, even now, the image of Babylon lingers as both glorious and decadent, both divine and corrupted, because at its heart was a truth we cannot escape, that longing is eternal, and indulgence is its most faithful servant. So, as you and I leave the temple, stepping once more into the night air, the scent of incense clinging to our clothes, the sweetness of offerings still on our tongues, we carry with us the knowledge that junk food was not merely a private comfort nor a public spectacle, but a thread stitched through worship itself, a reminder that even gods were imagined to crave, and that in feeding them, people fed themselves. And as you drift deeper into this vision, perhaps you feel your own cravings soften, not as sins but as echoes of something older, something woven into the very rhythm of human existence. The city sighs around us, the night grows deeper, and the story pulls us further still toward the moments when indulgence met danger, when cravings revealed not comfort, but the cracks in empire's foundation. And so, my friend, as the smoke of temple incense fades, and the echoes of festival songs dissolve into the silence of Babylon's vast night, we must admit that indulgence, for all its sweetness, carried a shadow that stretched longer than any wall of brick, longer than any prayer carved in stone. Because when cravings are fed endlessly, when oil thickens and honey pours without restraint, the boundary between comfort and decay blurs, and what once brought solace begins to reveal the fragility of an empire itself. Walk with me slowly now, past the doors of taverns gone quiet, past the courtyards where families sleep with crumbs still clinging to their lips, and into the darker rhythm of the city, the rhythm of excess turning to weakness, of indulgence whispering warnings no one wished to hear. Babylon was mighty in its towers, its laws, its armies, but in the alleys you could see another truth. That strength is not only tested by hunger, but also undone by abundance. Imagine the soldier who once ate fried onions to forget his loneliness, now unable to march without craving the same comfort. His body heavy with beer, his mind dulled by sugar. Imagine the scribe whose nights stretched long with clay tablets, once content with simple bread, now demanding sweet cakes that left his hands sticky and his concentration faltering. Imagine the children raised on scraps of temple offerings, who grew restless when plain grain was all that remained. Craving reshaped them, not into stronger people, but into people who needed indulgence to endure the simplest rhythms of life. The empire fed their longing, and in feeding it, weakened itself. A city that could not live without its sweets, its oils, its salted morsels, was a city slowly sinking into its own softness. And yet no one saw it clearly, because indulgence disguised itself as abundance, and abundance disguised itself as prosperity. The markets swelled with fried goods, the taverns overflowed with beer, the temples gave back offerings in handfuls, and the people told themselves this was strength, that Babylon thrived because everyone could taste more than survival. But beneath the surface, the oil reused one too many times brought illness. The beer clouded with impurities bred fevers, the sweets rotted teeth and weakened bodies, and still the city turned a blind eye, for the taste was too alluring, too comforting to question. Is that not the way of all civilizations, my friend? To mistake indulgence for security, to confuse the fleeting joy of craving satisfied with the deeper, quieter truth of endurance? I want you to see it, not as a lecture, but as a vision. Picture the grand walls of Babylon gleaming in the sun, while just beyond them a caravan of traders whispers that the city is bloated, that its people have grown soft, that soldiers stumble drunk before battle, that priests stagger from temples with honey still wet on their lips. Picture a marketplace where the poorest scrape coins to buy fried bread dripping with oil, while their fields grow neglected, their bodies tired not from hunger, but from the heavy weight of indulgence. Junk food, once a rebellion, once a small comfort against despair, had become a chain of its own, binding people to cravings that distracted them from the cracks widening beneath their empire. And yet, even in this shadow, there was tenderness, because people do not fall to weakness out of malice, but out of longing. The widow who chewed brittle to survive her grief was not the cause of decline. The child who licked honey from his fingers was not the reason towers crumbled. These small indulgences were human, fragile, innocent. The danger lay not in the sweetness itself, but in the city's blindness, in its refusal to see that comfort could also be poison when consumed without measure. Babylon's fall was written not only in battles lost, but in the quiet surrender to craving. The surrender that softened resolve, that dulled vigilance, that made every indulgence feel like entitlement rather than gift. And perhaps, as you hear this, you feel a familiar echo, because do we not live the same contradiction now? Do we not reach for things we know weaken us, because the sweetness is easier than restraint, because the salt on our tongues drowns out the silence of our own fears? The rhythm of Babylon is the rhythm of us all. Hunger answered too well, craving indulged too often, weakness creeping in like shadow until it feels like comfort. And yet, just as then, we tell ourselves stories of prosperity. We build walls, we raise towers, we praise abundance, forgetting that empires do not fall from hunger alone. The night around us grows heavier as this truth unfolds. You and I can almost hear the city groaning under its own weight, the stones of the ziggurat sighing as if they know that sweetness is never free, that oil always leaves residue, that salt corrodes as much as it preserves. But still, in the alleys, a mother fries another cake for her child. In the tavern, a soldier drinks another mug. In the temple, a priest tastes another honeyed offering, because life without indulgence feels unbearable, even as indulgence slowly erodes life itself. And perhaps that is the deepest tragedy of Babylon, not that it craved, not that it indulged, but that it could not see the difference between relief and ruin, between sweetness that soothed and sweetness that destroyed. Craving had become prophecy, indulgence had become destiny, and the city walked willingly into its decline, hands sticky with honey, lips salted with oil, eyes clouded with beer. Stay with me in this vision, my friend. Let it drift over you like the thick air of that ancient night, because it is not only their story but ours, not only their warning but ours. And as you listen, as your own breath slows and your eyelids grow heavy, you may feel the rhythm of their lives settle into your own, a rhythm of longing and consequence, of sweetness and shadow. And when you wake, you may wonder whether we too are building walls while craving snacks, praising abundance while softening into decline. But for now, let the story lull you deeper. Let Babylon's cravings cradle you, because the night is not over yet, and indulgence still has more to reveal in the chapters ahead. And so, my friend, as the story stretches forward like a torchlit road, you must imagine the moment when Babylon's cravings were no longer only its own, when the scent of frying oil and boiling molasses drifted not just through alleys and temples but into the nostrils of strangers who arrived from distant lands, traders and emissaries, wanderers who had crossed deserts with parched tongues and weary eyes, men who entered the city not only for grain, gold, or law, but for the seduction of its abundance. To an outsider, the first encounter with Babylon was overwhelming. The walls so tall they seemed to scrape the sky, the gates adorned with lions, bulls, dragons, the ziggurat towering like a stairway to heaven. But beyond the grandeur, what caught them most deeply was the marketplace, that pulsing heart where indulgence revealed itself in ways at once familiar and strange. Imagine a caravan trader stepping into that market, dust still clinging to his cloak, suddenly surrounded by smells that tugged at the instincts more powerfully than the sight of brick towers ever could. He breathed in the heavy sweetness of dates mashed into sticky cakes, the sharp salt of roasted fish sizzling on flat pans, the pungent tang of onions charred until black at the edges. And he realized that Babylon's strength was not only written in stone but also in flavor, in craving, in the ability to intoxicate even the foreign tongue. You see, when outsiders tasted Babylon's indulgences, they whispered of decadence even as their fingers reached for more. They mocked the priests for staggering with honey on their lips, yet they stuffed their own mouths with the very same sweets, unable to resist. They spoke of soldiers, softened by beer, yet they drained mug after mug of that cloudy brew, laughing louder than the locals themselves. Babylon's junk food became both scandal and seduction, a mirror in which foreigners saw weakness, but also a mirror they could not turn away from. And in that contradiction lies the strange power of indulgence. It condemns even as it enthralls. It weakens even as it binds. Outsiders carried these tales home. Stories of a city dripping with oil, reeking of beer, sticky with sweets. And yet, when they tried to recall the taste, their mouths watered, and they longed to return. Imagine the Greek traveler, centuries later, scribbling notes of Babylon's excess with disdain, yet secretly pocketing sesame brittle to chew in the dark. Imagine the Persian emissary shaking his head at drunken banquets, yet requesting more fried dough before his departure. Babylon's cravings were contagious, spreading like perfume that lingers on clothes long after leaving a room. Even its critics became its participants, and so indulgence became a form of conquest in itself, seducing outsiders before armies ever marched. Because what is empire if not the ability to export not only laws but also cravings, not only gods but also flavors? But indulgence as diplomacy was fragile, because the same sweets that seduced also betrayed. Foreign eyes judged, and in their judgment, they whispered that Babylon had grown soft, that its cravings revealed its decline. The roasted chickpeas, the sticky date balls, the endless mugs of beer became symbols of a city drowning in its own abundance. The outsider saw what the insider could not. That junk food, in its very nature, exposed vulnerability. A civilization willing to trade endurance for distraction, strength for sweetness. And yet, the outsider too was guilty, because craving is universal. And in mocking Babylon, they mocked themselves. Picture a caravan at night, camped just beyond the city's walls. Traders sitting around a small fire, unwrapping what they had bought that day. Fried bread cooling in the night air. Sesame brittle hard enough to crack teeth, molasses still sticky on their fingers. They laughed at Babylon's excess, called it foolish, yet they ate every crumb, their faces lit with the same delight as the Babylonians. And in the dark, when laughter faded, perhaps one or two admitted softly that they envied the city, envied a place where indulgence was not rare but daily, where cravings were not shameful but celebrated. That envy was dangerous because it planted both desire and resentment, admiration and scorn, a mix as intoxicating as beer itself. And so, Babylon's junk food became legend, spoken of in foreign courts, described in scrolls, carried in memory as proof of both wonder and weakness. To taste Babylon was to join its empire, even if only for a moment, to be caught in its web of indulgence. And outsiders, once seduced, carried cravings home with them, trying to recreate the flavors, to fry their own breads, to sweeten their own fruits, to brew their own thick beers. But without the walls, without the markets, without the noise of Babylonian nights, the flavors never tasted the same. And so the longing lingered, pulling them back toward the city they both mocked and adored. And here, my friend, is where the story turns sharper. Because foreign judgment is never only about food, it is about power, about envy, about the desire to topple what cannot be possessed. The whispers of decadence grew into plans. The scorn of indulgence hardened into strategy. And soon, outsiders did not only crave Babylon's sweets, they craved Babylon itself. The very indulgences that seduced them became excuses to condemn. The very cravings that bound them became reasons to strike. Because an empire that feeds its people so richly must surely be vulnerable, they thought. An empire so sweet must surely crumble when pressed. Junk food, once a comfort, had become prophecy again, this time in the mouths of enemies. And yet, even as the threat grew, Babylon did not change, did not restrain itself, did not silence its cravings. The market still fried, the taverns still poured, the temples still overflowed, and the people still licked honey from their fingers. They did so because to abandon indulgence was to abandon life. Because cravings had become identity. Because Babylon without its sweets was no Babylon at all. And so, they carried on, blind or perhaps unwilling to see that outsiders were watching, listening, planning. And as you and I linger in this vision, in the strange space between sweetness and downfall, perhaps you feel the weight of it pressing into you, the truth that outsiders will always judge, that indulgence is always both charm and curse, that what draws the world in can also be what makes it turn away. Babylon's junk food was not only its comfort, it was its reputation, its legacy, its double-edged gift to history. And as you drift further with me, you realize we cannot stop here, because the story of indulgence cannot remain at the gates of foreign envy. It must follow into what comes next, the moment when cravings did not only soften Babylon from within or invite judgment from without, but when indulgence became the very stage upon which conquest was written. Shall I take you then into the eighth wandering, where Babylon's sweet and greasy comforts collided with the brutality of invasion, and junk food became the last taste before collapse? And so, my friend, as the whispers of outsiders hardened into armies and the envy of Babylon's indulgences sharpened into blades, the city that had once intoxicated visitors with its sweetness and grease now found those very flavors lingering like omens in the mouths of conquerors who approached its gates. Imagine the night before invasion. Babylon still alive with frying oil, still humming with the crackle of onions in pans, still sticky with molasses dripping from trays in the markets, still echoing with the laughter of men and women who believed the walls were eternal. They ate because they could not imagine hunger. They drank because thirst had long been disguised by beer. They licked honey from their fingers as though sweetness itself could guard against steel. And outside, in the shadows of the plain, soldiers from distant lands crouched around their own fires, chewing on dried bread, on salted meat that was bitter and hard, their mouths dry, their bellies unsatisfied. They looked toward Babylon with hunger not only for conquest but for indulgence, for the tastes that had seduced them before, for the city whose excess became both promise and target. The clash that was coming was not merely of armies but of cravings, the disciplined hunger of outsiders against the dulled appetites of those within. Picture it. As the gates trembled under the weight of siege, Babylonians still tried to hold their rituals, still carried offerings of honey cakes to the altars, still fried dough for their children to quiet their fears. But indulgence, once a shield against despair, became a mockery of itself in the face of real hunger. For when grain stores thinned and oil grew scarce, the people discovered that their tongues, accustomed to grease and sweetness, struggled with plain bread alone. The cravings that once gave comfort now became torment, because the body remembers what it once had and refuses to settle for less. A soldier could march on bitter grain, but a Babylonian who had lived on honeyed cakes felt each mouthful of barley like punishment. The city was trapped not only by walls and armies, but by its own appetites, its own memory of indulgence that could not be forgotten, even in crisis. And when the gates finally broke, the conquerors entered not into silence, but into the smell of frying still clinging to the air, into markets half abandoned yet stained with grease, into taverns where mugs were left unfinished, into temples where offerings hardened in bowls. They tasted Babylon as they looted it, scooping handfuls of sticky sweets, biting into flatbread still warm, drinking beer left half full by priests who had fled. Imagine their laughter as they mocked the decadence, even while devouring it. Imagine their scorn as they licked honey from their own fingers, calling the city weak, even as they craved more. Babylon's downfall was not written only in spears and blood, but in the crumbs left on tables, in the sweets trampled beneath boots, in the realization that indulgence had made its people vulnerable in ways swords alone could not. Yet the story is not as simple as decadence destroyed by discipline, for the conquerors themselves could not resist becoming part of what they condemned. Soon their own camps reeked of frying oil. Their own soldiers drank Babylonian beer until their tongues grew heavy. Their own leaders demanded trays of honey cakes as spoils of war. The very junk food that symbolized weakness became the taste of victory, and in consuming it, the conquerors became what they had scorned. That is the paradox, my friend. Indulgence spreads like smoke, even into the lungs of those who swore they despised it. Babylon's cravings lived on in the mouths of its enemies, carried outward like seeds in the wind, planted in lands that once mocked it. But within the city, for those who had lived there, indulgence now carried a bitterness it had never known. The fried dough that once brought comfort now tasted of defeat. The beer that once softened grief now stank of loss. The honey that once dripped like blessing now clung to lips like ash. Families chewed slowly in silence, knowing the sweetness was stolen, knowing that every bite was shadowed by conquest. And yet, even in that silence, they still reached for it, because habits formed over generations cannot vanish in a single night, because craving is stronger than shame, because the body seeks what it knows, even when the spirit despises it. And if you walk with me through those broken streets in imagination, you will see it. Children still licking crumbs of sesame brittle while rubble smolders, widows still clutching jars of molasses as if they held life itself, soldiers of the victors staggering drunk on Babylonian beer, shouting songs in foreign tongues while grease drips from their fingers. The city was conquered, but indulgence remained, mocking both conqueror and conquered alike, reminding them that sweetness does not vanish with walls, that cravings outlive empires. In this way, Babylon's junk food became its final voice, not in epic inscriptions, not in victories carved in stone, but in the taste of fried dough lingering in the mouths of enemies, in the sticky fingerprints left on looted jars, in the quiet cravings that survived even when the empire itself had fallen. Cravings cannot be conquered, my friend. They only travel, transform, disguise themselves in new wrappers, in new rituals, in new markets. And so, Babylon's decline was not only a warning but also a bequest, a legacy of indulgence carried forward into every city that came after. A reminder that sweetness and weakness walk hand in hand, that salt preserves and corrodes in the same breath, that oil both nourishes and sickens. And as you drift deeper into this thought, as your eyelids grow heavier with the rhythm of their downfall, you realize that the story has not ended, that Babylon's cravings have merely shifted into other ages, into other tongues, into other kitchens, always whispering the same paradox, that what comforts us may undo us, but still we reach, still we chew, still we swallow, because life without indulgence feels like no life at all. And so, my friend, as the whispers of outsiders hardened into armies and the envy of Babylon's indulgences sharpened into blades, the city that had once intoxicated visitors with its sweetness and grease now found those very flavors, lingering like omens in the mouths of conquerors who approached its gates. Imagine the night before invasion. Babylon still alive with frying oil, still humming with the crackle of onions in pans, still sticky with molasses dripping from trays in the markets, still echoing with the laughter of men and women who believed the walls were eternal. They ate because they could not imagine hunger. They drank because thirst had long been disguised by beer. They licked honey from their fingers as though sweetness itself could guard against steel. And outside, in the shadows of the plain, soldiers from distant lands crouched around their own fires, chewing on dried bread, on salted meat that was bitter and hard, their mouths dry, their bellies unsatisfied. They looked toward Babylon with hunger not only for conquest but for indulgence, for the tastes that had seduced them before, for the city whose excess became both promise and target. The clash that was coming was not merely of armies but of cravings, the disciplined hunger of outsiders against the dulled appetites of those within. Picture it. As the gates trembled under the weight of siege, Babylonians still tried to hold their rituals, still carried offerings of honey cakes to the altars, still fried dough for their children to quiet their fears. But indulgence, once a shield against despair, became a mockery of itself in the face of real hunger. For when grain stores thinned and oil grew scarce, the people discovered that their tongues, accustomed to grease and sweetness, struggled with plain bread alone. The cravings that once gave comfort now became torment, because the body remembers what it once had and refuses to settle for less. A soldier could march on bitter grain, but a Babylonian who had lived on honeyed cakes felt each mouthful of barley like punishment. The city was trapped not only by walls and armies, but by its own appetites, its own memory of indulgence that could not be forgotten, even in crisis. And when the gates finally broke, the conquerors entered not into silence, but into the smell of frying still clinging to the air, into markets half abandoned yet stained with grease, into taverns where mugs were left unfinished, into temples where offerings hardened in bowls. They tasted Babylon as they looted it, scooping handfuls of sticky sweets, biting into flatbread still warm, drinking beer left half full by priests who had fled. Imagine their laughter as they mocked the decadence, even while devouring it. Imagine their scorn as they licked honey from their own fingers, calling the city weak, even as they craved more. Babylon's downfall was not written only in spears and blood, but in the crumbs left on tables, in the sweets trampled beneath boots, in the realization that indulgence had made its people vulnerable in ways swords alone could not. Yet the story is not as simple as decadence destroyed by discipline, for the conquerors themselves could not resist becoming part of what they condemned. Soon their own camps reeked of frying oil. Their own soldiers drank Babylonian beer until their tongues grew heavy. Their own leaders demanded trays of honey cakes as spoils of war. The very junk food that symbolized weakness became the taste of victory, and in consuming it, the conquerors became what they had scorned. That is the paradox, my friend. Indulgence spreads like smoke, even into the lungs of those who swore they despised it. Babylon's cravings lived on in the mouths of its enemies, carried outward like seeds in the wind, planted in lands that once mocked it. But within the city, for those who had lived there, indulgence now carried a bitterness it had never known. The fried dough that once brought comfort now tasted of defeat. The beer that once softened grief now stank of loss. The honey that once dripped like blessing now clung to lips like ash. Families chewed slowly in silence, knowing the sweetness was stolen, knowing that every bite was shadowed by conquest. And yet, even in that silence, they still reached for it, because habits formed over generations cannot vanish in a single night, because craving is stronger than shame, because the body seeks what it knows, even when the spirit despises it. And if you walk with me through those broken streets in imagination, you will see it. Children still licking crumbs of sesame brittle while rubble smolders, widows still clutching jars of molasses as if they held life itself, soldiers of the victors staggering drunk on Babylonian beer, shouting songs in foreign tongues while grease drips from their fingers. The city was conquered, but indulgence remained, mocking both conqueror and conquered alike, reminding them that sweetness does not vanish with walls, that cravings outlive empires. In this way, Babylon's junk food became its final voice, not in epic inscriptions, not in victories carved in stone, but in the taste of fried dough lingering in the mouths of enemies, in the sticky fingerprints left on looted jars, in the quiet cravings that survived even when the empire itself had fallen. Cravings cannot be conquered, my friend. They only travel, transform, disguise themselves in new wrappers, in new rituals, in new markets. And so, Babylon's decline was not only a warning but also a bequest, a legacy of indulgence carried forward into every city that came after, a reminder that sweetness and weakness walk hand in hand, that salt preserves and corrodes in the same breath, that oil both nourishes and sickens. And as you drift deeper into this thought, as your eyelids grow heavier with the rhythm of their downfall, you realize that the story has not ended, that Babylon's cravings have merely shifted into other ages, into other tongues, into other kitchens, always whispering the same paradox, that what comforts us may undo us, but still we reach, still we chew, still we swallow, because life without indulgence feels like no life at all. And so, my friend, when Babylon itself had sunk into ruin and its towers had become legends more than landmarks, the cravings it birthed did not dissolve with the dust, for cravings are not bound to walls. They travel. They seed themselves in the marrow of other civilizations, and they grow into new indulgences that carry the taste of the old. Imagine the Persians, marching through the conquered gates, at first sneering at the sweets and fried dough of the city they called decadent. Yet within a generation, their own festivals echoing with the same smells, sesame brittle cracking in their teeth, honeyed cakes passed from hand to hand. Imagine the Greeks, scribes of the world, describing Babylon's decadence in tones of disdain, yet in their marketplaces selling fried fritters dripping with oil, sweetened wines thick with syrup, little indulgences too close to what they condemned. The Romans too, later, building their empire on iron and law, still found themselves unable to resist the quick indulgences of the street, the fried fish, the sticky nuts, the sweets pressed into the palms of children. Babylon's cravings lived inside them, disguised but unbroken, and in that way the city survived, even as its stones crumbled. For indulgence is more contagious than conquest. An army can impose law, a king can carve edicts, but the craving for sweetness, for salt, for grease, slips quietly into the daily life of those who taste it, and once tasted it cannot be forgotten. Babylon's junk food became a silent ambassador, spreading from one civilization to another, not through treaties but through mouths. A trader in a distant port who chewed on fried bread carried not just flour and oil but memory, carried the whisper of a city that once pulsed with craving. A soldier who returned home with jars of date syrup poured them out in foreign kitchens, and his children licked their fingers with the same delight as Babylon's, never knowing they were partaking in a legacy older than their own gods. And so, Babylon outlived Babylon, hidden in indulgences that spread across the world. And yet, even as it spread, the memory of its fall lingered, and other civilizations could not forget the caution that indulgence weakens, that craving softens, that sweetness leads to decline. They told themselves stories of moderation. They praised restraint. They warned against decadence. Yet all the while their festivals overflowed with the very indulgences they claimed to fear. A Greek philosopher might write of Babylon's folly while his students nibbled honey cakes. A Roman senator might scold the city's excess while sneaking fried fish before debate. The contradiction was never resolved, because craving is stronger than principle, because sweetness is stronger than caution, Babylon's legacy was not only flavor but paradox, a paradox inherited by every civilization that came after. Think of how this paradox traveled across centuries, how medieval feasts groaned with sugared almonds, while priests warned of gluttony, how Renaissance markets spilled with candied fruits, while scholars lectured on virtue, how in our own age the glow of neon signs sells fried dough and syrup under the guise of convenience, and still we tell ourselves to resist. Babylon's ghost lingers in each bite, a reminder that humanity has always lived between craving and consequence, between indulgence and regret. The city is gone, but its junk food is everywhere, its aftertaste clinging to us like oil on fingers, like honey on lips. And so, as you and I drift now into the long shadow of history, we realize that Babylon's true immortality was not in its gardens, not in its walls, not in its laws, but in its cravings. For every time a child licks sugar from their fingers, every time a tired worker chews fried food to silence despair, every time a festival overflows with unnecessary sweetness, Babylon is there, whispering through the centuries. Its junk food became not only memory but mirror, showing us that we too live in the same rhythm, the same cycle of indulgence and regret, comfort and decline. The only difference is the wrapper, the stall, the name, but the craving itself is eternal. And perhaps, my friend, as your breath slows and your eyelids grow heavy, you feel that truth settling into you that we carry Babylon in our kitchens, in our cravings, in our restless nights, when we reach for what we do not need. The empire has fallen, but its appetite has not. And maybe that is the truest empire of all. The empire of longing, the empire of indulgence, stretching across centuries, across civilizations, across you and me. And so we close this wandering not with an ending but with an echo, the echo of frying oil, of sticky dates, of laughter in the night, the echo of a city that refused to vanish because its cravings were too human, too deep, too eternal. And tomorrow, when you wake, perhaps you will taste it again in something small, something sweet, something unnecessary yet irresistible. And you will know that Babylon still breathes in you. And so, my friend, we arrive at the soft edge of the journey, where the echoes of Babylon's streets fade into the hush of our own quiet rooms, and what remains is not the roar of conquest, nor the glitter of towers, but the lingering taste of sweetness, the faint crackle of oil, the memory of cravings that outlived the city itself. You and I have walked together through marketplaces thick with smoke, through taverns heavy with laughter and sorrow, through temples where offerings blurred into indulgence, through ruins where flavors survived, even as stones collapsed. And what we have discovered is that Babylon was never only a place on a map, but a rhythm, a craving, a heartbeat that still thrums beneath our own skin. Civilizations fall, yes, but longing does not. And so here, at the closing of the tale, you might notice that the story of Babylon has become the story of yourself, of your own late-night hunger, of your own secret indulgences, of your own small rebellions against the weight of days. Close your eyes and imagine, for a moment, the last flicker of a Babylonian night, the torches guttering low, the markets finally quiet, a mother whispering to her children as she shares the last crumb of fried bread, a soldier wiping honey from his lips before lying down to dream of tomorrow's battles, a priest chewing slowly on a sweet he had sworn was meant for the gods. These images are fragile, fleeting, dissolving into the dark, yet they are the truest relics of the city, not the stones, not the gates, but the cravings that bound them all. And as we reflect, we see that what we call junk food is not junk at all, but memory made edible, comfort made tangible, longing made visible in oil and sugar and salt. To chew on Babylon's food was to chew on hope, on grief, on fear, on joy. And in that act, they were no different from us. You see, history is not only carved in tablets or sung in epics. It is whispered in kitchens. It is fried in pans. It is licked from fingers sticky with syrup. Babylon teaches us that to understand a people, you must taste their cravings, because cravings are the purest confessions, unfiltered by pride or propaganda. No king would admit weakness, but the way his soldiers devoured fried onions told the truth. No priest would inscribe indulgence, but the honey on his lips revealed it. No empire boasts of decline, but the grease on its fingers betrayed it. And perhaps you realize now that this is why the story of junk food matters, that what seems trivial is the very thing that carries truth. Because it is through small, unnecessary indulgences that we glimpse the human heart most clearly. And so the conclusion is not harsh, not filled with judgment, but tender. For Babylon's cravings were not sins so much as songs. Songs of survival, songs of longing, songs of comfort in a world that was always uncertain, always fragile. We cannot scorn them without scorning ourselves. For we too live by the same rhythm. We too reach for what we do not need. We too soften the blows of life with sweetness. To eat late at night when no one watches. To sip something strong to blur the silence. To fry something greasy when the heart feels heavy. This is not modern weakness. It is ancient inheritance, Babylon whispering in our vein. And perhaps that is the deepest gift of this wandering. The realization that you are not separate from the past but woven into it, that the cravings you feel are not only yours but echoes of a million hands reaching before you, that every bite carries a lineage older than you can name. When you taste salt, you taste soldiers by the fire. When you taste honey, you taste children laughing in dusty alleys. When you taste beer, you taste priests staggering from temples. When you taste fried bread, you taste the heart of a city that refused to live by survival alone. Babylon is not gone, because you carry it each time you indulge, each time you crave, each time you allow yourself the small rebellion of comfort. And now, as the story draws to its close, let us rest together in this thought, that history is not only about empires rising and falling, but about the way people lived in the spaces between, the way they soothed themselves, the way they resisted despair through something as small as food. Perhaps the stones of Babylon will never rise again, but each time you find yourself reaching for sweetness in the dark, each time you comfort yourself with something unnecessary, you walk again through its markets, you sit again at its taverns, you pray again at its altars. The city lives not in ruins, but in rhythm, in craving, in indulgence that binds the ancient to the modern like a thread unbroken. And so I leave you, gently, in that rhythm, with questions to carry into your dreams. What cravings do you hide? And what do they reveal of your own heart? What small indulgences sustain you? And what do they whisper of your own empire? When you taste sweetness, do you taste only sugar? Or do you taste the memory of civilizations that came before? And when you wake tomorrow, will you see your own cravings not as weakness but as echoes? As reminders that to be human is to long, and to long is to live. Good night, my friend. Let Babylon's whispers soften into lullaby. Let the oil and honey fade into dream. Let the cravings that outlasted empires carry you into rest. And if you find yourself returning here tomorrow, I will be waiting, with another wandering through history, another rhythm of life to soothe you, another story to remind you that even in the ruins of time, comfort lingers. Until then, may your night be gentle, may your cravings be kind, and may the story of Babylon settle around you like a blanket of memory, warm and unbroken. Goodbye.